Okay, hello everyone. My name is Hind Elyas, and I'm the Acting Vice President of TESOL Sudan. Today I'm going to talk about intercultural instruction. What is meant by intercultural learning? Intercultural learning is the process of becoming more aware of and better understanding of one's own culture and other cultures around the world. Next, please. Any kind of communication across different cultures should involve a few things. First of all, we need to remove any sort of misinterpretation caused by the language barrier and cultural differences. And it's very important to respect other cultures. Most people from other cultures really appreciate it if you show interest in their culture. If you don't know about a culture or a language or a country, you can just ask, and that way you can, and you just say, can you please tell me about it? And that way you open up a venue of conversations. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about culture. What is culture? Culture is a way of life. It's a set of social practices, a system of beliefs. When we talk about culture, we need to understand cultural differences, deal with cultural differences. Another definition for culture is beliefs and assumptions that most people are not aware of and cannot examine intellectually. So when we're talking about culture, a good way to think about it is by using the iceberg analogy. Next slide, please. Okay, it's not in the slides. We often use the analogy of the iceberg to talk about culture. So the visible part of the iceberg is observable behavior, and it's things that you can see, touch, like food, music, dress, language, etc. However, the most dangerous part of the iceberg is the 90% that's underwater and cannot be seen. And that is the case in culture as well. The norms, which are the rules for behavior in specific situations, and values, which determine what's good and what's bad and what's acceptable and what's not, are part of the 90% that's underwater. So when icebergs collide, it could be valuable or invaluable. It's valuable when we know the other people's values and we can explain and interpret their behavior and know why they're behaving in a particular way. It's invaluable when it's evaluation. Sometimes we think that if behavior is different from ours, we often describe it as negative. So it's very important to understand the unobservable part of the iceberg. If we don't understand the different, which means the cultural differences. So if we don't understand that, it's problematic in cultural situations. So what is the aim of intercultural communication? It's to increase international and cross-cultural tolerance and understanding. And lack of awareness of cultural norms between teachers and students can cause a lot of problems. If for the teacher, it will lead to misunderstanding by the teachers and alienation from their peers. For students, they also need to pay attention to politeness, social status, different expressions, etc. Now I'm going to give a few examples of different cultural differences. For example, if we talk about eye contact in the classroom, in many African countries, it's not polite if you don't make direct eye contact with your teacher. Whereas in other countries, it's not acceptable. So it's very, very important to understand the culture of your students. Another example is some teachers in some countries don't like their students to correct them. And if students don't understand a question or question their teachers, teachers get offended and they don't like it. Whereas this is in some African countries, but in other Western cultures, it's acceptable. Another example is snapping fingers. When students want to answer a question, instead of putting their hand up, they snap their fingers. So this might be inappropriate in a Western setting. So that's why it's really important for us to know the culture of our students. Next slide, please. So intercultural awareness in language learning is often talked about as though it were a fifth skill, which is the ability to be aware of culture relatively following reading, writing, listening, and speaking. The aim is to raise students' awareness of their own culture, and in doing so, it helps them interpret and understand other cultures too. This is also known as culturally responsive teaching, which means using the cultural knowledge that it already exists, the prior experiences and performances of diverse students, and you use that information to make it more appropriate and effective for them. So the teachers need to understand their students' culture. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about intercultural learning that we used in our school in Sudan. So I worked in Sudan, and it was an international school. So in general, most international schools in Sudan use Oxford and Cambridge books. And many of the parents and students are not familiar with the British or Western culture. So if they don't understand the culture, they won't be the students won't be motivated to learn, as they can't relate to the Western culture that's projected in the textbooks, and that will lead to alienation. So in our school, we used intercultural learning, and that helped students become more aware of their own culture and the culture of different countries around them. And we use that to compare it. We compare the two cultures, and it was very, very interesting. So I'm going to give you a few examples of different plays that we had. We had a Sudanese version of William Shakespeare's Macbeth and The Merchant of Venice. Next slide, please. So in my Shakespeare class with IGC students, we adapted A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we made a Sudanese version of the play. And it was very interesting because the opening scene was a Sudanese wedding where students were dressed in Sudanese costumes, and there was Sudanese music playing, and people loved that. They just got up on the stage and they started dancing, and it was exactly like a Sudanese wedding. So it was very interesting how we changed the Shakespeare scene to a Sudanese scene. And that was just the opening scene, and it grabbed people's attention. So it was very interesting. And another play that we did was Macbeth. The witches scene was replaced by tea ladies. So tea ladies, we have a very common phenomenon in Sudan where we have tea ladies sitting on stools everywhere, selling tea and coffee to people who pass by. So the students were very familiar with that and were able to make a kind of Sudanese Macbeth scene. And it was very interesting. For example, you can do that in the class even without planning, just by, for example, if you have we had a writing scene, which was a writing passage, which was about a blizzard. So because the students in Sudan, some of the students were not familiar with it, we replaced it with a sandstorm, which is very, very common in Sudan. If you can see the picture on your right, the students were able to relate to it, and it was very interesting. Next slide, please. So intercultural awareness is very important. It's important for educationalists. They have to explore pragmatic ways of designing books that can address the traditional and cultural barriers of English language learning in Africa. For institutions need to keep pace in today's complex and competitive global arena. And for students, by incorporating diverse content perspectives and approaches into the curriculum, faculty can strengthen scholarship and prepare students for today's complex world. Next slide, please. Last one. Finally, this is the last slide. The benefits of intercultural instruction. There are lots of different benefits. Teachers can learn about the students. They can provide a structured but flexible learning environment. They can make education relevant and useful. They can develop an awareness of the impact of culture on learning. And finally, they can help students succeed without losing their cultural identity. And my time's up. One last slide. So a good way to do all that is by building on students' personal and cultural strengths, and we talked about that previously, using appropriate instructional methods which are related to the student's culture, tapping community resources, creating different paths to learning by using different types of instructional activities. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.